Welcome to the Energy Capital Podcast. I'm your host, Doug Lewin. To understand what's happening, you have to know how you got there. You need a sense of the history. That's one of the reasons I've enjoyed interviewing past commissioners and chairs of the Public Utility Commission. At the Texas Power Podcast, I interviewed Pat Wood and Barry Smitherman, both former chairs. Here at Energy Capital, the very first episode was with former Commissioner Will McAdams. All are episodes that are still well worth listening to. In between Pat Wood and Barry Smitherman at the Public Utility Commission, years in which the restructuring of the market passed in the 1999 legislature was being implemented at the PUC. The chair was Becky Klein, my guest today. Becky played a critical role in the implementation of the restructuring of the Texas electricity market. After leaving the PUC, she served as both vice chair and chair of the Lower Colorado River Authority, which owns several gigawatts of power plants. She serves on a number of energy company-related boards. And if all that isn't enough, Becky also founded and serves on the board of the Texas Energy Poverty Research Institute. Her vision really brought that organization into existence. It's an organization dedicated to reducing energy burden and making sure that energy is abundant and affordable for all Texans. There are few people better situated to help understand what's happening today, especially as we grapple with rising demand, a rapidly changing resource mix, evolving market design, technology breakthroughs, an affordability crisis, and much more. During the episode, Becky shared her past work on Texas energy and regulatory matters and her vision for the future of the Texas grid. We explored her work with TEPRI, the Energy Poverty Research Institute, discussing the challenges and opportunities in the energy transition to alleviate energy poverty. We also discussed how to ensure access to reliable electricity, enhance affordability, and we got into the role of oil and gas in the broader energy landscape. First part of this podcast is available for free. The rest is available to paid subscribers. Please become a subscriber today at douglewin.com. That's DOUGLEWIN. And please leave us a 5-star review at Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thank you very much for being a listener. Have a great day. Becky Klein, welcome to the Energy Capital Podcast.
Thanks, Doug. So glad to be here with you.
And so glad you're able to do this. I've really wanted to interview you for this podcast for quite a while. You're a tremendous thought leader in Texas around all things energy and really excited to dive in. We'll cover a lot of ground today, but before we kind of jump in to the deep end, help our audience understand, talk a little bit about your background, both some of the things you're doing these days, but also your time as chair of the PUC and kind of how you fit into the energy world in Texas.
Sure, I'd love to do that. And I think I'll take us back about a quarter of a century. It seems like yesterday, though. So I had come from working in Washington, D.C., and came back and was working at the Public Utility Commission. And that's really where I got my chomps for electricity and telecom. And so when Senate Bill 7, which started us out on restructuring of the electric power industry, was being discussed in the legislature, I was working as a policy director for the governor at the time, Governor George W. Bush. And so that's where I really began, I would say, my career heavily with the restructuring in the electric power sector. And so after I left George W. Bush, I ended up, and it's another story for another day, but I ended up at the PUC commissioner and chairman. And so was actually implementing SB 7 and getting the rules executed at the time. And we were in the throes of doing a pilot when I was starting out at the commission for our competitive retail markets. And so I was at the commission doing that. And at the time, we were both restructuring the power industry, but simultaneously ushering in competition in the telecom industry. So it was hot and heavy back then as well, but for different reasons. And so I have been vested in the market since then. It's very dear to me. And I have watched it closely for the last 25 years.
You were you appointed by Perry or by Bush? It was Perry, right?
I was appointed by Perry. I was working for George W.'s transition team up at the time up in D.C. after he won his presidential election. And then that's when Governor Perry called me and said if I would come back down and be as chairman of the PUC. And so I did that.
And you were chair from what year to what year?
I was at the commission from '01 to '04 and chairman, I guess, for the last 2 years of that time frame. And as it was only myself and Commissioner Brett Perlman at the time.
Right.
Because we were down one. We were only 3, but we were down 1. So it was just 2 of us.
Yeah.
And it was very different dynamics.
Yep.
Because we couldn't talk to each other. It's not like when you have 5 today.
Right. Brett, who is now the director of the Center for Houston's Future, doing great work over there. So 1999, SB 7 passes, but the implementation doesn't start until 2002. So you're commissioner and then chair right in the middle of that period as competition is beginning. I was particularly impressed and really enjoyed listening to your testimony to the Senate Business and Commerce Committee. I was really excited that they asked you, because a lot of times the legislature hears from the same folks over and over again. It was really refreshing to hear them ask you questions in the discussions. This was in February of last year, just at the very beginning of the legislative session. And you talked a lot to them about sort of the similarities and the differences going back those 20, 25 years. The market was obviously changed in a major way back then. There are changes happening now too. Can you talk both about the similarities and differences? And I think the process at the time, I've talked with Pat Wood about this. I'm interested to talk to you about it as well. You talked with the Senate about it, that y'all traveled, you went to different places, including the UK, to kind of learn they were in a restructuring and to kind of learn lessons from them. So similarities and differences, both with the changes to the market, but also kind of process. And if there's anything folks today might learn from some of the process things you guys did back then.
Sure. There was a strong foundation that was laid for restructuring the market. And it started really in 1995 when wholesale competition came into being. And then in 1997, the state legislature attempted to pass retail competition. And it just didn't go. There was just too many divergent interests and differences. And then so 1999, SB 7 actually passed. And I think what was really helpful at the time, too, was that, we have strong thought leaders in our state legislature today. We had very strong thought leaders in our legislature back then as well, with Senator Sibley, his counterpart in the House, House Member Woolens. And the two of them really were the ones that were the wingmen that helped fly in SB 7. And so they were aligned in their purpose and in their vision for SB 7. And that was very helpful to get that going. And of course, state leadership wanted that all the way around. So there was a unity of purpose and there was a actual direction where we knew where we're headed.
Yeah, that makes sense. So can you talk a little bit about what do you see as the fundamental issues, almost sort of the problem statement, if you will, of like what, and maybe again, kind of compare and contrast to then, because we're going through this time where the market is definitely going through some changes. How big those changes will be, whether it's as you put it to the Senate Business and Commerce Committee, I believe you were quoting Margaret Thatcher, where you said the lady makes no U-turns, whether or not we actually make a U-turn here and go in a completely different direction, or make some other major changes that don't constitute a U-turn, because there's already been major changes made to the market. Can you talk a little about the problem statement, what you think has been done already, and maybe what is left to be done?
So as I see the problem statement, I really feel that it all comes down to first principles. And what I mean by that is really having some clarity about where we're going and what framework we're going to be doing our business and developing our market design off of. So we knew way back then that we were going to a competitive market and an energy only market. And so everything rolled off of that. And we knew that what our job was is to really develop the guardrails within which that competitive market can thrive and survive. And of course, over the course of the last 20 years, we've always needed to make changes, and new technology would come in, the grid would change, population would grow at some level, climate change. And so you have to change those guardrails, right? You have to widen the road, or whatever it may be. Today, we're at a point where we're evaluating what direction we're going to be going in. Are we going to stay, where we are committed to a competitive market? Are we going to go to a capacity market that's more centrally controlled? What are we doing? And I think it's important that we do that due diligence. I'm not knocking that. I think it's very crucial that we make data-driven decisions in this market, and that the entire market gets the opportunity to have their voices heard about how it's impacting each and every one of them, so we can better assess which way to go. And I think by the end of the calendar year, and certainly by the end of May of next year, we're going to know which direction we're headed. That's not to say that we still have changes that, the PUC needs to make, given the fact that there's so much new technology, there's so much load growth for here in Texas and abroad. And that's an exciting place to be. And it's an opportune place to be, as long as we are really committed to our first principles once we decide what those are.
Yeah, and you laid out a couple of those first principles when you were talking to the Senate. You talked about commitment to competition in markets. You said, and I'm quoting you here, free markets are more adaptable markets. You talked about tech neutrality, about policymakers needing to sort of define standards and characteristics to let the market rise to that standard. You talked about how we don't want to limit the future of technology. None of us know where technology is headed, and if you sort of pick a technology, you could be limiting something that else that might come in. Do you think that those principles are the ones that are sort of most in mind? How confident do you feel that those are the principles that still sort of rise to the top in Texas, or are there others you're seeing that you think are more sort of ascendant?
Well, my personal opinion is that those are the principles that we ought to be adhering to. Now, are those the principles that are more pronounced today? I think, yeah, sort of, is my answer to that.
That's a good answer. Yeah, sort of is
Uh-huh.
accurate. Yes.
I think with exceptions, that's the principle today.
Mhm.
And I see that, there's also playing around with these other ideas that are getting away from an energy only and more competitive market structure. And so I think that what's important right now is that there is a process and a methodology in which we're assessing those alternative ways of doing a market design. And we'll get to a point where there will be a decision as to, okay, that's not going to work for us. Let's go ahead and continue to augment and improve what we have today and what we have had. And there's already been a lot of improvement on that over the last year and a half, right?
Yeah, maybe we should talk about some of that. I do feel like there has been this kind of drift towards more and more kind of an emphasis on a centrally planned system versus sending a market signal and having the market respond to meet that need, particularly around, well, I do want to come back to the principle and what we talked about in sort of defining the standard and the characteristics. I think that the question is, it really does kind of come down to what are the characteristics? And I've heard you say many times, and you're certainly not the only one to talk about it, that when we're looking at Winter Storm Uri, because a lot of the changes in Texas were obviously sort of an outgrowth of that really catastrophic event and necessity of making sure that it never happens again. But a lot of folks were convinced that it was a capacity problem. We didn't have enough capacity. And again, you talked about in the Senate, and I've heard you talk about in other places. Winter Storm Uri was much more about performance of the capacity we had, sort of a lack of operational performance, operational flexibility. Is that still your view? It's been a while since I've heard you say that, but is that still your view? And if so, where do you kind of go if those are the different, if don't you go one direction if you're really trying to get more capacity, and maybe potentially a different direction if you're trying to get more flexibility and performance, or do those take you to the same place? Thank you for listening to this free preview of the Energy Capital podcast. You can access the entire episode as well as archives of articles from the Texas Energy and Power newsletter if you become a paid subscriber today at douglewin.com. That's DOUGLEWIN.com. You'll also be able to attend paid subscriber only chats and webinars. Please check it out, and thank you for listening.